Some of you are probably familiar with the sculpture I'm going to show you a picture of in just a moment. This question isn't for you. This is for the people who aren't familiar with the sculpture. And the question is, who do you think this is? With the horns, yes. If I told you it was carved by Michelangelo, would that help at all? It is Moses. So what's up with the horns? It turns out that there were some translation problems. Our first lesson, we heard about Moses coming down off Mount Sinai for the second time with the Ten Commandments, as Mark said. The first time sort of starts in chapter 20, where we actually read the Ten Commandments, the most common version. There are actually three versions of the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew Scriptures. The first version is in Exodus 20. We read that, and then it goes on for another 4 chapters, I think it is, 4 chapters with more laws being dictated by God. And finally, when we get around to chapter 24, Moses goes up on the mountain for 40 days, and he actually gets the tablets, along with a whole bunch of more instructions about the priesthood and about worshiping God and what the facilities for worshiping God should be like. And those actually go on for, I forget how many, 7 chapters, something like that. So then Moses finally, in chapter 32, Moses comes down the mountains, stone tablets of the law, only to discover that the Israelites had made for themselves the golden calf, and they were worshiping that because Moses had been gone for so long, 40 days. Moses, you don't deserve this, smashes the tablets. Luckily, Moses and God cooled down, and at God's direction, Moses goes back up the mountain to commune with God. He's directed to lug up 2 replacement tablets. So he has to bring those up the mountain and gets the law again, comes back down, stays there another 40 days, comes back down with the 10 Commandments. And that's where our scripture picks up. Moses comes down off the mountain, didn't realize that his face was glowing, and that's where the translation problem happens. The Hebrew word that gets translated glowing or beaming is very similar to the Hebrew word that commonly means the horn of an animal. And so the Greek and Latin were sometimes translated into those words, into horn. And so when Michelangelo was carving David, he based on his Latin scripture that Moses had horns when he came off the mountain. So instead of being beaming. So that's where that comes from. Little trivia there, isn't that fun? It does seem to me, though, to be a strange mistake. Now, I don't know 16th century Italian, but certainly 16th century Italians must have had the experience of seeing somebody's face beaming. That a baby getting praised by mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, a teenager in love, a woman who's pregnant. I know I've experienced women who are pregnant. Sometimes I experience them like radioactive Buddhas. We get a bunch of glowing in our gospel lesson, and it's up on a mountain as well. Jesus just heard Peter's declaration that he's the Messiah, the Christ. That was in last week's scripture lesson. And I mentioned last week that it seems to me that almost upon hearing Peter say that you're the Christ, you're the Messiah, that something clicks for Jesus, that suddenly he realizes, bing, I am the Christ. And what that means is that I'm going to go face down the principalities and powers, and they're going to kill me. And if you want to follow me, you need to be ready to take up your cross daily as well. In fact, you need to embrace the possibility of dying daily. I don't know about you, but if I just realized that being who God called me to be meant I was going to die, I would need a little time out. And so I'd need to go step back from everything. And I'd need to talk to a trusted friend, and I would need to talk with God, and I would need some reassurance from God that even if it was necessary, it was going to turn out okay, and even if it meant death, it was going to turn out okay. One of the things that I think happens in the drama of the Transfiguration is that Jesus is getting precisely this reassurance. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on the mountain to pray, and while he's praying, he starts glowing. His face changes, his clothes become blindingly white. Two people show up. Moses and Elijah. Moses, the father of the law. Elijah, the father of the prophets. One way Jesus is unique, Luke is unique in telling the story of the Transfiguration is that he tells us what Moses, Elijah, and Jesus were talking about. Many translations say that they talked. Many of the other two Gospels, Matthew and Mark, say that they talked, don't say what. But many translations, when they translate what they were talking about, say that they were talking about Jesus' departure, his passing, his decease, the one that would be accomplished soon in Jerusalem. The Greek is much richer. They use the same word that's used for the Old Testament, Exodus. They're discussing Jesus' Exodus. The Exodus, capital E, Exodus, is the foundational story of Judaism. It's the story of liberation and life and redemption, freedom from slavery, the establishment of a new community and a new nation. Here, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus are talking about Jesus' Exodus. It's not surprising me that they're talking about liberation, life, and redemption, especially in Luke's gospel. Remember how Luke starts off the Jesus story, Jesus' ministry. He has Jesus go to Nazareth and read from the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Luke begins his telling of Jesus and Jesus' good news by setting it out as a mission of liberation and life and redemption. And here at the Transfiguration, Jesus converses with Moses and Elijah, the fathers of a religion birthed out of the Big E Exodus, the Big E story of liberation, life, and redemption. They talk about Jesus' Exodus. Yes, being the Christ means you're going to be killed by the principalities and powers, and that will be a new vehicle of liberation and life and redemption. Another way Luke's telling of the Transfiguration in a unique way is that Peter, James, and John fall asleep. It makes me so proud of them because it means I too could be a disciple. I like to nap. None of the commentaries I read on this passage made anything of this moment of Peter, James, and John falling asleep, but it reminds me of another time Jesus is going to pray with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they fall asleep. They can't stay awake as he is struggling with what it means to face the principalities and powers and what it means to die. At the Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John don't miss all the important spiritual action in Luke's version. They may fall asleep, but they wake up before Moses and Elijah have left. They don't appear to overhear any of the discussion, but when Moses and Elijah leave, Peter starts talking, not even thinking about what he's saying. Dude, this is so cool. We got to build like some monuments around this. We got to hold on to this event forever. And though Peter doesn't understand much more than that he is having a powerful mystical experience, the mystery responds to him. The mystery responds to James and John and envelops them all in a great cloud of brilliance. And they hear the words that Jesus heard at his baptism. This is my son, my child, my chosen one. It is tempting to desire a life filled with mountaintop experiences. It is tempting to chase after the mystical, to seek the radiant cloud of knowing and being known. It is tempting, if we want to find that cloud, if we find that cloud, to want to stay there. It's nice up there. It's nice to be separated from the struggle and the desperation of those who need the exodus, to be separated from those who need liberation, life, and redemption. Except that we can't really separate from that because we need liberation, life, and redemption. Each one of us has brokenness that needs healing. Each one of us is in need of exodus. Each one of us needs our ransom paid, our freedom secured. And so we can't get away from it. The best we can hope for are moments of deep connection that pulls us out of ourselves and into that unnameable something that we call God. Eventually Moses and Elijah leave. Eventually the cloud lifts. Eventually it's just you and me and Jesus standing there. And it's time to go back down the mountain. If we're lucky, we won't be the same. If we're lucky, we too will have been transfigured. If we're lucky, that radiation exposure will have changed us, and maybe we'll come back down the mountain glowing in some way. Moses' face shone so brightly when he came down the mountain that it freaked out the Israelites, and so he veiled it. He had been in the presence of the light so incandescent it has been known to kill people, and after that experience, his face was the moon. It reflected the greater light that we can't look at directly. There's a story I heard long ago that has resonated with me. I've used it in sermons before. But it's one of those stories that just has meaning for me. It's the story of a man who was a boy in Europe during World War II. I don't remember which side of the front he grew up on. It doesn't really matter. For him, the war was about seeking shelter during the bombings and then trying to find a childhood amidst the rubble. One day, while wandering around a bombed-out home, he found a piece of broken mirror. It was shining, it caught his attention, and he picked it up and started playing with it. And he had some fun reflecting the sunlight over there and into that dark corner of rubble. So much fun that he started rubbing the edges of this mirror down, this shard of mirror, until it became safe to carry and to put in his pocket. And on the days when the bombs weren't dropping, he'd play Reflect the Light. Can I get the sunlight to shine over into that corner, underneath that pile of rubble? The boy grew and became a man and said that he discovered that that game he played as a child was, in fact, his vocation. His calling in life, no matter what job he had, no matter where he was to reflect the light into the dark and shadowy corners of the rubble of people's lives. Only the light he was called to reflect wasn't the light of the sun. It was the light of God. This shining, this reflecting of God's light is what the season of Epiphany to Lent, the season we conclude today, is all about. It is a season of light. We started with the Magi noticing the light in the sky and following it to worship Jesus. And each text in the lectionary from January 6th to Transfiguration Sunday is meant to throw light on who Jesus is and what he means to the world. Today's texts of shiny faces and shiny landscapes and promises gives us a glimpse at the glory that we are called to reflect in the world. Amen.